The first time I saw Nader Shah, I was afraid of him. I had heard his name long before I ever saw his face. In Delhi, people spoke about the Persian king in quiet voices. They called him a conqueror, a ruthless warrior, a man whose army had crossed mountains and deserts and defeated those who stood in his way. I believed every story I heard. I thought a man like that could have no heart left inside him. Then, one evening, I saw him standing alone in a palace courtyard. His clothes were covered in dust, his sword hung from his side, and there was blood on his armor. But he wasn't celebrating. He wasn't speaking to his soldiers. He was simply looking at the night sky. I remember wondering why a man who had just won a battle looked so lonely. He turned and saw me. Our eyes met, and I immediately looked away. I thought he would ignore me, but instead he walked toward me and stopped a few steps away. "What is your name?" he asked. I told him. Then he asked, "Are you afraid of me?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to be brave. But I couldn't lie. "Yes," I whispered. For a moment, he said nothing. Then the corner of his mouth moved slightly, almost like a smile. "Good," he said. "At least you are honest." Then he walked away. It was only a few words, but I remembered them for the rest of my life. I never imagined that those few words would be the beginning of the greatest love and the greatest sorrow I would ever know. In the months that followed, my life slowly became connected to his. I left India behind and found myself traveling with the Persian army across endless roads and unfamiliar lands. At first, everything frightened me. The soldiers, the horses, the weapons, the endless camps that appeared and disappeared like shadows. But slowly, I became used to that life. And slowly, I began to see Nader differently. To everyone else, he was a king. To his soldiers, he was a commander. To his enemies, he was a man to fear. But when the crowds disappeared and the camp became quiet, I saw another Nader. He was tired. He was often unable to sleep. Sometimes he would sit alone beside a dying fire long after midnight, staring into the darkness as if he were waiting for an answer that would never come. One night, I found him there. I stood a few steps away and asked, "Why are you still awake?" He looked at me and said, "Kings don't sleep easily." I smiled and answered, "Perhaps kings should sometimes forget they are kings." He looked at me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a quiet laugh, but I had never heard anything so beautiful from him. That night, he told me about his childhood. He told me about Khorasan, about hunger, war, loss, and the years when he had almost nothing. He told me that he had learned very young that nobody would come to save him. He had to become strong enough to save himself. I listened without interrupting. And for the first time, I understood that the man everyone feared had once been a lonely boy who had been afraid too. That was the moment something inside me changed. I stopped seeing only the king. I began seeing the man. And that was when I made the mistake that would cost me more than I could ever imagine. I fell in love with him. I tried to hide it. I told myself it was impossible. How could a woman like me belong beside a man like him? His world was filled with armies, kingdoms, and blood. Mine had once been filled with quiet streets, family, and the familiar smell of home. But love does not always ask permission. It simply arrives. Some nights, he would come to me after speaking with his commanders. He would sit beside me without saying anything. Sometimes he would take my hand and hold it in silence. Those moments were the only moments when I felt safe. I began to understand his silences. I knew when he was angry, when he was tired, and when something was troubling him. And I began to realize that behind all his strength was a man who was terribly lonely. One evening, after a long argument with his commanders, he came to me and said, "The enemies outside our borders do not frighten me." I asked him why. He looked toward the darkness and said, "Because I know where they are." Then he looked at me. "The people closest to me are the ones I fear." I took his hand and told him, "You don't have to fear me." He looked down at our hands. "I know," he whispered. But there was sadness in his voice. At the time, I didn't understand why. Now I do. Perhaps he already knew that the people closest to him would one day be the ones who destroyed him. As the years passed, Nader became harder. His victories made his empire larger, but they also took something from him. He trusted fewer people. He smiled less. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and find his place beside me empty. I would step outside and see him standing alone beneath the cold sky. I would ask what was wrong, and he would always say, nothing. But I knew he was lying. There was always something. There was always another war, another enemy, another betrayal waiting somewhere in the darkness. I began to fear that one day the world would take him away from me. I was right. I just didn't know how soon. The night it happened began quietly. The camp was almost silent when I woke. For a few seconds, I heard nothing but the wind moving through the tents. Then came a scream. I sat up immediately. Nader was asleep beside me, exhausted after another long day. I touched his shoulder. Nader. His eyes opened instantly. Years of war had taught him to wake like a soldier. Another scream came from outside, followed by the sound of running feet and clashing steel. I whispered, "There are men outside." He reached for his sword. I grabbed his arm. "We have to leave." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw no king in his eyes. I saw only the man I loved. He gently pulled his arm away. A king cannot spend his life running from death. Tears filled my eyes. "I don't care about the king," I said. "I care about you." He became silent. Then he stepped closer and placed his hand against my face. His hand was cold. "If I don't come back." He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. Neither could I. He kissed my forehead. It was gentle, almost painfully gentle. Then he walked outside. I followed him. The camp was burning. Men who had once fought beside him were now attacking him. The same soldiers who had once shouted his name were now raising their swords against him. Nader fought back, but there were too many of them. I watched the man who had crossed mountains, defeated armies, and built an empire stand alone in the middle of the chaos. And for the first time, I understood how fragile a powerful man could be. The night that followed became a blur of fire, blood, and screams. I don't remember how long I stood there. I only remember searching for him through the smoke. Then, as the first light of dawn appeared, the fighting began to fade. The camp was silent again. But this time, it was the silence of death. I stood among the burning tents and realized that the man I loved was gone. I had spent years believing that Nader Shah was too powerful to lose. I was wrong. No army could defeat him, but betrayal found a way. Years have passed since that night, but sometimes, when the wind becomes cold and the night grows quiet, I remember the first time I saw him looking at the sky. I remember the tired eyes, the dust on his clothes, and the lonely man hidden beneath the crown. People remember Nader Shah as a conqueror. They remember his battles, his victories, and the empire he built. But I remember something else. I remember the man who once sat beside a dying fire and told me about the boy he used to be. I remember the hand that held mine in the darkness. I remember the last kiss he gave me before walking into the night. And sometimes I wonder if he knew, even then, that he was leaving me forever. I never found another love like his. Perhaps I never will. Because some people enter your life only once. They leave scars that never completely disappear. And even after all these years, when I close my eyes, I can still hear his voice beside me. "At least you are honest." "Yes, Nader. I was afraid of you when I first saw you. But I was even more afraid of the day I would have to live without you."